Thank you all for joining ORF America for the virtual launch of the uh, Blueprint Report to advance the U.S.-India Energy Security Partnership. For those of you who are new to ORF America, the Observer Research Foundation America is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C., dedicated to addressing policy challenges facing the United States, India, and their partners in a rapidly changing world. Here at ORF America, we produce research, curate diverse and inclusive platforms, and develop networks for cooperation between the developed and developing world, based on common values and shared interests. Our key areas of focus are international affairs and security, technology policy, economic development, and energy and climate. This event is being hosted by the ORF America Energy and Climate team. I'm joined by my colleague, Caroline Arcology, who is part of that team. And I'm Medha Prasanna. I'm a junior fellow and program coordinator for the Energy and Climate team at ORF America. Big picture, over the last couple of years, ORF America has closely tracked energy and climate policy developments in both countries and studied the history and evolution of this relationship so that we can understand what to expect. To further these conversations and create more diverse platforms, last year, ORF America also hosted the U.S.-India Emerging Climate Leaders Program. Besides the U.S.-India energy and climate relationship, we also explore energy transitions in global South countries and the role that they play in diversifying energy supply chains. This report is a culmination of multiple workshops hosted by ORF America in 2024 and 2025, and it created a space for stakeholders to have honest conversations about the future of the India Energy Partnership, and included energy experts from both governments, think tanks, research institutions, trade groups, and academia in both Washington, D.C. and New Delhi. Dr. Aditya Ramji, who has actively participated in these workshops and worked closely with us to author this report, is an economist focusing on transportation, energy systems, and electric mobility. He holds a PhD in transportation technology and policy from UC Davis and currently serves as a director for the India and Global South Clean Transportation and Energy Program at UC Davis. Previously, he has worked at Mahindra, where he focused on the automotive sector and was closely involved with overall business strategy, as well as the company's vision for electric mobility, mobility solutions, and product strategy. Prior to that, he also worked at two of India's leading think tanks on energy and climate policy, the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, or CEEW, and the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, both based in Delhi. We're joined today by Dr. Anit Mukherjee, who will be steering this conversation. He is a senior fellow of the Global Economic and Development Program, and he leads that program at ORF America. He was previously a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development and an associate professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi. So over to you, Anit and Aditya, and for our audience members, feel free to put in questions in the chat throughout this webinar, and we will address them as and when appropriate and intermittently. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Medha, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. Aditya, it's been great to have you as a participant in all the seminars and the convenings, as well as taking this report to its conclusion along with my colleagues at ORF America. So we are really grateful. Just to start off, could you give us a brief overview of what this report aims to achieve and some idea of its recommendations? And then we will, about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation about some of the topics that you have highlighted. Over to you, Aditya.
Perfect. No, thank you so much, Anit, and thank you, Medha, and the ORF team. It's as always, it's great to partner with all the right institutions and kind of help move our collective goals. So it's been quite exciting working on this, and I'll say that because when we started this work and when we first got involved about a year ago, I think we've many things have evolved and changed in the last 12 months or so. it's also been almost a moving goalpost and document as we've been working through it. But I'll just maybe spend the next few minutes in providing just a slight overview of what this blueprint covers and highlights, and then of course, hopefully, it'll make for some interesting reading for all of you that are listening in. But as you know, most of you know what the context is. But just to kind of help recap, there has been a fairly strong bilateral cooperation between India and the US in the past 2 decades. But more recently, in February, when Prime Minister Modi visited the US, the two countries kind of reaffirmed their commitment to this bilateral cooperation. We saw the launch of the US-India Compact, which kind of put energy security, critical emerging technologies, and trade at the center. There was also the US-India Trust, or the transforming by utilizing strategic technologies, which also kind of provides a cross-cutting platform for cooperation. So this year, and then of course, we have the ongoing bilateral trade negotiations and discussions that are already happening, with the intent that bilateral trade could go up to at least about $500 billion by 2030, which will require double-digit growth. Just to kind of give you context, where bilateral trade stands at around 130 billion in this past year. So in many ways, this next 12 to 15 months will be crucial and critical in terms of how the two countries shape their bilateral relationship, and hopefully kind of continuing to build on the shared goals of industrial policy and energy security. The blueprint itself kind of puts in context what we would like to call the US-India Strategic Energy and Industrial Partnership. This kind of takes into account some of the changing narratives around energy transitions, and let me put it in simple words. It kind of rests on three pillars, right? One, to be able to develop and deploy energy technologies at scale, both at home and abroad, reduce concentration in energy supply chains and manufacturing of new energy technologies, and then continue to strengthen both the domestic industrial base of the two respective countries, but also the bilateral industrial corridor between the United States and India. But just like any partnership, to be successful, industrial policy, technology development, and competitiveness will remain at the center, and kind of almost act as concurrent objectives. And maybe there are, I would maybe frame this as a four-pronged approach to kind of getting through this. There's research, development, and innovation, where focusing on next generation emerging and critical technologies will remain significant. It's about being able to identify technologies where we can leapfrog beyond some of the existing ones, where we can build competitiveness 5 or 7 years from now. There is obviously mirroring the success of the Indus X, which is the US-India Defense Acceleration Ecosystem. We now have the Indus Innovation platform, which also hopes to advance some of the industry academia partnership, and including space and energy. And it was interesting, the other day I was just going through some of the updates. India has InSpace, which was created as one of the public-private accelerators for space technologies. But there's a lot of work going on right now to cross-pollinate technology between space and automotive and other sectors. And I think there are similar efforts ongoing in the US as well, and also offers another way of how we look at new and emerging sectors and cooperation. The second pillar, sorry, would be around trade and investment. I already mentioned the ongoing discussion on getting a trade agreement going, but I think there is within that there are some opportunities that obviously lie, but from an energy transitions perspective, two spaces that almost offer a ready opportunity is one around the battery supply chain and two around the automotive sector. The reason I mention both of these is the supply chain exists because there is demand from end-use technologies, and a lot of that is coming from new technologies in the automotive sector. And so we need both of those to go in parallel, without which one or the other will always struggle to find that level of resiliency. But this will require not an organic, but an actual intentional strategy for supply chain resilience and competitiveness, both very important objectives for both countries. Um, and and this will also mean that this will provide an opportunity to reorient supply chains over the next few years. Um, if you look at it, interestingly, the US is expected to see some domestic battery production deficits going forward. India is still building out a lot of capacity that could go online in the next few years. And there's just one example to give you a sense of how we can look at opportunities over a period of time that can help to create a resiliency on both sides through unlocking some of the trade and investment opportunities. There's obviously within that framework a significant play for technology transfer. Through the US IRA over the last 5 years, we've seen some significant investments in the United States by tier one, tier two players in the supply chain, something that is very critical to being able to accelerate and create resilient investments in technology capabilities. We saw the case of Northvolt in Europe, which is a good example of why you need a balance between tier one and tier two players in that ecosystem. And India definitely could benefit from some of that. The third piece around this would be public-private partnerships. Nothing that's unheard of, but just being able to once we know and prioritize some of these strategic spaces, I think there is an opportunity to be able to catalyze specifically private sector players and investments that are needed to realize these different pillars. There are opportunities. There is India is also building out a significant battery recycling and ancillary component ecosystem, could provide a significant alternate hub in the global supply chain, especially when we're looking to de-risk and diversify. And then most importantly, but when we talk about partnerships, is the need to be able to leverage existing institutional mechanisms as opposed to creating new ones. So that will always remain something fundamental so that we can continue to think about how to make these more efficient and timely. The last pillar would be around finance. Finance is a key area. I mean, without capital, we will always talk about the vision and the plans, but that is needed to be able to actually effectively execute. We will probably need to think and move beyond the typical instruments that are offered, whether it's through USDFC, US EXIM, USTDA, but being able to think about what are the new financial institutions, new financial instruments, and the other private investors that could potentially play a significant role. To that extent, maybe thinking about a finance for strategic sectors track might be very useful, where to bring together players on both sides to actually look at and identify a pipeline of projects of potential investment across these priority sectors that could actually help accelerate and unlock some of the capital that we're thinking. Let me, just take a few minutes to just kind of deep dive a little bit and highlight some opportunities and then, hopefully that will provide some ideas for those listening in. There were three areas that the blueprint kind of looks into. One, as I mentioned, was around accelerating commercialization of strategic technologies and battery supply chains. Both countries will, over the next decade or so, are expected to see some significant growth in battery demand, and therefore, in extension, demand for raw materials and other components. I mean, just to kind of give you a sense, lithium demand for both India and the US, based on how they are expected to move in the next decade, is expected to increase about 8 times in the next decade over 2024 levels. But there's also an interesting perspective here, which is many minerals such as nickel, copper, graphite. I mean, they all have, of course, a lot of interest from a battery and energy technologies supply chain perspective, but are also having significant demand coming from base industrial sectors like infrastructure and steel, which are foundational to economic growth. And so being able to think about economy-wide strategy around raw materials could actually set a very interesting and differentiated partnership around the way we think about supply chain cooperation. And not to mention that both countries are net importers of minerals at the moment. But of course, there is a significant effort on both sides to be able to think about and expand domestic exploration, etc. And I think that but there is in that context there is a two-pronged strategy. Exploration and extraction takes time, and by the time, even if we were to find viable resources, they take time to come online in the market. We're talking at the fastest, 7 to 10 years, which means that over the next 5 to 10 years, you will still need to get raw materials from somewhere to be able to ensure that your existing operations are able to sustain. And so, in that context, there is a immediate strategy about raw material security, and then there is a longer term strategy on how you unlock some of the resources that you have either domestically or elsewhere. And this is also where I should highlight that the landscape around minerals, while of course began in energy transition technologies, has obviously expanded to include other sectors like defense, aerospace, and high value electronics, kind of highlighting their importance as what we call dual use inputs. So maybe a couple of opportunities there. Of course, on the resource mapping capabilities itself, there is a lot that can be done between USGS and GSI. In the two countries can also think about joint deployment of capital in mineral assets and refining in both in either their own respective countries, but also outside in other geographies. There'll also be technology partnerships for battery manufacturing, recycling, which hopefully can build on the strategic mineral recovery initiative that was also announced. Interestingly, in that context, we often talk about refining as one of the key gaps in the supply chain. When we also build out recycling, a very similar refining capacity has to be built out. So even if as we're expanding recycling, we should be able to actually have some refining capacity that's also being built out at the same time, which does provide some very interesting opportunities to diversify on the supply chain side. Of course, we're hopeful that international cooperation through the multilateral platforms, whether it's MSP or Quad, will continue. But one last thing I will mention on this particular track is the importance of track and trace. I mean, the motivations for doing track and trace of supply chains are different depending on which country or geography we're talking about. But at least in the context of the US and India, the ability to have joint track and trace approaches to identify vulnerabilities, investment opportunities, and technology development can be very, very useful in how we build out an expanded and resilient supply chain, and also kind of help bring in the right kind of technology partnerships. The second piece is around automotive cooperation. Technology advance. Both countries are major automotive hubs, and technology advancements, keeping in pace with global developments, will be very critical to ensure competitiveness of the sector in both countries. Often when we think automotive, we talk about just vehicles, but we should also recognize that there is another sector of automotive supply chain in terms of automotive components that are also a big part of the trade value chain. For example, about 27% of India's component exports are actually to the US as of 2024, although we may not be the largest trading partner in that sense. But if you expand the US automotive ecosystem, which actually is larger in the context of USMCA, then the exposure of India into that automotive value chain for the North America market is actually much higher. But one other interesting thing is, again, when we talk of electric vehicles, we often think cars. There are also opportunities beyond in other vehicle segments that exist. In the US, many subnational governments continue to drive their goals around e-mobility, but specifically, there's just one example that I wanted to highlight. Often talk about low emission electric buses for transit and school buses, which has been a big program in the US. But one of the challenges is very limited manufacturing capacity domestically, which provides a significant opportunity for potentially Indian electric bus manufacturers to consider investments in the US, and really making this a two-way partnership in many ways. And it's and opening opportunities for Indian players also to come and operate and play in the US market. I think a couple of things there. Of course, as the trade discussions go on, being able to focus on the automotive sector and providing the right kind of enablers for FDI by both the US and Indian companies would be very critical. Technology access and development across EV powertrains, ADAS systems, etc., not just for cars, but even trucks, can be very, very significant in driving the sectors on both sides. And then finally, can also look at expanding transportation cooperation beyond automotive to even aviation and shipping, where we can think about drones, VTOL aircrafts, aviation fuels, marine fuels, etc. The last pillar, the third area that we were thinking about as we were exploring this blueprint was around what I would call emerging fuels, but two pieces, hydrogen and nuclear. I know it's been very debated, but if you think about it, there are shared priorities in both countries as far as energy security goes. One, ensuring affordable and reliable energy for end use sectors. Two, advancing grid reliability and resiliency. And three, obviously, both markets are now looking at increasing the share of nuclear in their mix. One thing that stands out is, or two or three things that can stand out in this context are: one, there is an opportunity to scale hydrogen deployment through a combination of both gray and green hydrogen. And we can delve into this, Anit, as we talk through this a little later, where it'll help to manage costs, including prioritizing end-use sectors like steel, ammonia, and fertilizer. There is an opportunity to leverage cost-competitive electrolyzer manufacturing in India. It's already happening, and so that this can actually help build and expand manufacturing across both countries. And when I say it's happening, it's actually happening through companies that are headquartered in the United States. And then finally, there is obviously a renewed opportunity for bilateral cooperation on nuclear energy, including private sector investment and technology licensing. I'll just stop there, but I'll end with this to say that the two countries are very well positioned to leverage the respective strengths. We've often talked about the opportunities and the intents on both sides, but with the fact that we're now having some of these discussions in a more tangible manner, I think all of us, it would be safe to say, are really looking forward to an opportunity where this vision can actually be turned into action. And just to kind of round it out, I just want to recap the three things that I think this partnership will rest on. One, to develop and deploy energy technologies, both at home and abroad, opportunities around diversifying supply chains, and finally, to strengthen the domestic industrial both the domestic industrial base and the bilateral industrial corridor between the two countries. I'll stop there, but thanks, Anit, and look forward to having more open conversation on this.
Thank you, Aditya. That was a very, very comprehensive, but also very, I would say, structured and very precise. How you outlined the areas for cooperation. So let me start first with the broad, right? I mean, you will delve into the nitty-gritties of each of the sectors. But by the way, we also we would appreciate if the audience sends us their questions in the chat, and my colleagues are monitoring it. We will try to incorporate as many of your comments as possible. But to start off, so you started this project, Aditya, when there was a different dispensation in the US, and the government in India was just coming with the new mandate, right? So when you started and when you are here now giving us the recommendations, a broad overview, how has they changed or not?
So maybe terminologies change, but I think if you look at it, let's look at it like this: there may be certain narratives that might have shifted, but from an industrial competitiveness standpoint, right, which has now become pretty much a very important pillar for almost every country, as we look at all of this discussion around energy transitions or new technologies, etc. If you want an industrial base to be competitive, you have to follow global trends, and so private sector will want to ideally and make those right investment calls, but will need the right enabling ecosystem in their own respective domestic markets as well to be able to enhance that level of international cooperation, and kind of unlock and be able to play in the global supply chain. And I think that has not changed. So for me, if that remains as a strong foundation of the intent for partnership, I think it should continue to help unlock some of this, among the areas that we talked about.
So, just if I can summarize it, since from a non-technical perspective, so this is policy continuity, which goes across or doesn't get affected or too much disturbed by political changes in the political dispensation. Is that correct? Is that a way of
That's right.
assessing?
That's right. And that's right. And I think the intent of kind of deep diving into some of the specific three sectors that we talked about that I just mentioned earlier, was with the hope that these are spaces where this continuity would exist, in one way or another, irrespective of other changes.
Excellent. So, I mean, I think EVs, because you also are an EV expert. So I think for people who don't know, Aditya has, he has been one of the key prime movers behind India's EV strategy, working with Mahindra. I think India is one of India's largest, I think, EV manufacturer, I would say. Um, in the EV sector and the EV, and you try to make this connection between the sectoral emphasis on EV, which is the end use, and the inputs that go into that sector through changes in technology. It could have been fuel standards maybe 15 years ago, which was driving changes in the way engines were made, and today it is moving towards cleaner and greener fuels, which is making this transition to batteries, right? Now, I think given your experience in this sector, how have you seen the last 10 to 15 years progress? How have you seen the progress in the last 10 to 15 years? Specifically, when the end use is changing so rapidly, the battery technology is changing rapidly, the way the cars are designed and made are changing rapidly. And how do you see that? What experience can you draw from that 10 years of the past 10 years and see what the next 10 years would look like?
Sure. I mean, well, let me put it like this. I think the automotive sector has now almost come to a sense of global convergence in terms of consumer preferences, and so to that extent, markets are not that very different. I mean, just to give an example, I mean, we are seeing what we in the transport world like to call the SUVization of automotive. Of the automotive sector in cars, but that's happening, and that's there in the US, as many of us know. But that's pretty much the same story now in India. But more importantly, also, I think the Indian automotive sector has also expanded significantly in terms of its play in the global value chain, in the last decade. But on the other hand, the US automotive sector has actually kind of almost walked away from global
Hmm.
competitiveness in the last decade. I mean, we've seen the likes of Ford and GM and others exit India and many other markets over the last decade. And I think there is an opportunity here. There is an intent on both sides in both administrations currently in the two countries to want to expand and continue to see their respective corporations kind of be able to be global players. And we've always heard murmurs about, the intent of Ford wanting to go back to India, but with an all EV strategy, etc. So I think there is an opportunity. And many of the US OEMs have had strategic JVs in India in the past. I mean, there's Navistar for trucks, and etc. And so I don't think there is lack of precedence. It's a question of providing that level of certainty and opportunity for private sector to take advantage of. Having said that, I mean, irrespective of policy and in both sides, markets have started to grow as far as new technologies are concerned. We're seeing electrification happen. It's continuing to happen in both sides, and across segments, not just cars, but we're now seeing it in trucks. We're seeing it in other spaces. So there are huge opportunities, which also means that, and this is what I was trying to say, that if you want to create investments and certainty for market to come in, you have to create demand certainty. And the end use technology then also creates certainty for rest of the supply chain. And so we can talk all we want about supply chains and critical minerals and and batteries, but at the end of the day, these exist because there is that end use technology. So there is a very strong, and I think this goes to the earlier point I made around the opportunity to strengthen bilateral industrial corridors. I mean, the automotive sector to that extent is a prime example of where we can see significant success, and it can meet objectives that are well beyond just about trade or allowing companies on both sides to participate in the two markets, but also kind of actually unlock exactly those pieces on the new energy value chain, supply chain that we've been talking about, but also be able to help bring in that right set of investments and resilience and diversification opportunities.
That's excellent. No, that makes things much clearer, I think, in terms of what that industrial corridor would look like. Two things. I'll just I have two follow-up questions on the EV side. So let's take battery technology, right? Today there is a lot of talk about how the inputs, the critical minerals, the supply chain is more or less dominated by one country. Just the raw materials, be it within that country, be it from outside, wherever the outside sources are, right? And you mentioned that there could be one day when we would have synthetic batteries, synthetic instead of relying on fully on critical minerals, we would have some sort of a diversification in terms of what you can produce in the lab and what you can use, right? So that would reduce the demand a little bit, or quite substantially. I don't know. I mean, honestly haven't made the modeling, but you also mentioned that the tech adoption is an issue. So when technology changes, to adopt that takes 10 years or 15 years. Have you seen any instance of the technology change that has happened in the EV sector? Let's take EV sector. I'm not talking about the solar. That the adoption rate has increased, basically leapfrogged from a 10-year or 15-year cycle to a 3 or 5-year cycle. Have you seen that at a practical level in given your experience in EV?
Yeah, so I mean, I think to that extent, the other markets, maybe the EU or China, whatever, are good examples of this, right? I mean, I think there are two elements here. One is if you go through the conventional sectoral approach of, okay, we're developing new technologies and we want to move the market in the right direction, then you need some other policies that can help accelerate that market within the timelines that you want or accelerated timelines that you would like. In which case, I mean, the EU is well known with its fuel efficiency regulations and whatnot in the automotive sector to be able to help drive that in the right direction. Automotive taxation in China, it was more, the California type mandate-driven approach and kind of driving the OEMs to deliver more in the market. But either way, I think the message is that you still need to create the right set of market acceleration transformation policies, and that regulatory certainty is what helps to drive market certainty. But I'll also add a different dimension to this since we're talking about supply chains. There are opportunities beyond this, and I think this is where I mentioned briefly about the idea of expanding this narrative to defense and aerospace sectors. Now, these are strategic sectors. In one way, people say, okay, they have more capital, they're not too worried about finance, etc., and they'll do their own thing. But the thing is this: they are sectors that have the opportunity to accelerate lab to commercialization, but they are not high volume demand sectors for the components or raw materials. So this is where a strategic intersectoral play between, and I'll use critical minerals as a good example. EV batteries or the electrification of automotive sector will be the high demand volume game for these materials, but the defense aerospace sectors can be the strategic commercialization vehicles to help drive that acceleration to technology development and market commercialization. So I think this ability to think about this from that perspective, both domestically within each country, but also then use this as part of the bilateral cooperation that we already have these platforms on IndusX and Trust and the Mineral Recovery Initiative and all of these pieces, which almost kind of give you that platform to make this a reality. I think is a distinct opportunity that lies for the two countries.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Thank you. Just the last one on EVs and the supply chains, right? And this goes beyond EVs as well to other forms of clean energy supply chains. So you said there's something very interesting, a data point that you mentioned also in your presentation, that 24% of the components used in the US auto components come from India, but also 6% of auto components of Mexico's imports also come from India. And that was a really interesting data point for me to know that, as the automotive supply chains have been diversified across NAFTA countries, and I don't know the numbers for Canada. I presume it would be quite to that order. How have the uncertainty around tariffs on the automotive sector uh, change the perception or the risk perception of those kind of investments and that trade? Have you seen an impact on that?
Well, let me put it differently. When we think bilateral cooperation, right, and this is a good example, we think, oh, how much is the trade between country X and Y, and then how much do I get impacted? But when you look at this in the USMCA context, and this is where I think India needs to think differently, is 80%, just as an example, and a data point that's probably not in the document, but I should mention, is 80% of Mexico's automotive production is actually for the US market, right? And so our exposure beyond the US to also supply what we supply as automotive components to the Mexico ecosystem, indirectly is destined out there. And so the point is that every time there is a potential disruption in the USMCA ecosystem beyond the US, including into Mexico, this has potentially an impact on Indian component suppliers who are playing across that integrated market, and playing across both sides. And I think this is where India also needs to be able to think about the possible impacts and how we therefore then think about a careful and strategy and engagement with the US on being able to ensure that it does not negatively impact our industry and our players as well, right? And so I think this is one thing where, just an example, I mean, and I'm putting this in the context of how some of the potential impacts of tariff could also impact India beyond the usual way of looking at numbers of it's bilateral trade and it doesn't affect me, and so I stay out of it. But I think in this case, because of the way the North America automotive market is structured, is something that we need to think about and have as part of the way we think and strategize on how we look at the bilateral engagement with the US as well.
Oh, thank you. I think that's a very fair point, that if you have diversified supply chains and each under a different regime, like say preferential trade agreement, how does India's bilateral trade agreement kind of reduce exposure, the risk of those supply chains getting disrupted? Is that more or less a fair
Yeah,
assessment?
absolutely.
Great,
Absolutely.
great. Okay, let me pivot a little bit to other sources. The new fuels that you said, fuels of the future, are in some sense it's already there, but will have more impact. First is green hydrogen per se, and then the second is nuclear. By the way, there was some reporting today that there would be a change in the nuclear liability, the Atomic Energy Act of 1962, on the nuclear liability issue. We don't know. This is just reporting coming from India. Has some papers have reported that, but
Right.
we'll come to that. But let's start with the hydrogen issue, right? It's a new fuel, but we are already seeing, at least in Washington D.C., where we are, some of those things. This bus is powered with green hydrogen, and you mentioned something very interesting in the blueprint, that there are different standards of how do you call it, the how you nominate one hydrogen as green or gray. Can you explain a little bit on this difference, and how does it impact on the India-US India bilateral trade in hydrogen?
Sure. No, I've always found this fascinating, and I think for the others who are listening, I mean, hydrogen went from one or two colors to now I think we've got seven or eight different colors. But but when you look beyond colors for a second, I
There's
mean, at
also
the end of
blue,
the
right?
day, there
There's
is
also
blue,
blue
there's
as well.
green, there is
Yeah.
there's all kinds of things. But my point is, when you look beyond colors, the whole point of this is defined based on CO2 emission intensity of the hydrogen produced, and therefore those are the thresholds, and that's what matters at the end of the day. So one thing that, as you keep looking at this carefully, you start to realize that blue or whatever, the same color in two different geographies may be the same color, but they're not the same thresholds. Right. And so that's where suddenly you realize that we're talking something very different. And then actually is not as difficult, maybe. And hydrogen is a good example of this. I mean, in the US, the threshold for green hydrogen when the mission existed was around 1 kilogram CO2 per kg of hydrogen produced. And for India, it was and in case of India, the green hydrogen definition is actually no more than 2 kilogram CO2. So it's almost 2x the difference. The point is that in that context, then technically, what is India's green hydrogen above that 1 kg to 2 kg benchmark would actually constitute as gray or blue or whatever else in the US. And so my simple point to this is that I think it's for the moment, if we go beyond colors and actually talk about actual emission intensity and look at hydrogen production in that context, I think there is a lot more that actually exists in terms of cooperation between the two countries. And maybe we should, for the moment, give up this whole color-based definition because it sometimes confuses and almost provides a constrained environment for looking at cooperation, right? The moment you open this up in terms of numbers, then you're actually talking gray and green hydrogen, and then you're saying, okay, then it's no more just a continuous push because we are seeing. I mean, let's face it. I mean, look at California as a good example. We've had a hydrogen ecosystem for a long, long time here in California, but we are seeing challenges. I mean, the cost of hydrogen is not easy to bring down. So obviously the intent is to be able to look at this as a fuel that can actually get into the market, help diversify and across end users, and I think from a lot of my other colleagues who work a lot more on hydrogen than I do, I always hear this joke about it being the fuel of the future forever. So, but there is an opportunity, right? I mean, and the point is that as India also looks to scale this up, right? And we've got, obviously India has a focus on doing about 5 million metric tons in the next 5 years. And then there are sectoral priorities: steel, ammonia, fertilizers, but there's also emerging end users in transportation. So the point is but you need to also then provide affordable fuel at the end to the end use sector. And that's where I think when you look at the emission thresholds as the narrative, then you start to realize that there is a lot more that can be done, and you can actually help to manage and do a mix and match of the different types of hydrogen to actually help deliver, blended, affordable fuel for end use sectors, and then help scale up. And this is where SMR or natural gas based hydrogen production becomes part of the play when you look at those emission threshold numbers. And in that scenario, it's interesting. I mean, India has had this long-standing vision of being able to, build about 15% of energy mix as natural gas. We're still doing a lot of LNG imports. The US is obviously a strategic player in that context, and there is a lot of natural gas demand that's still there in India and growing. We're seeing a lot of gas distribution, city networks, etc. So that'll happen. But the point is that there is also this new avenue where you can utilize some of the natural gas to help build out affordable hydrogen ecosystems. And so when you look at it from that context, and I think there lies an interesting set of opportunities again between the two countries, both in terms of also being able to actually bring private sector players. And in fact, there has been an existing India-US hydrogen, bilateral working group that has existed in the previous administration. I mean, so players exist. people know each other. It's just a question of bringing everyone back to the table under a slightly different narrative, maybe, and looking at how that can actually get to a greater sense of cooperation and action on the ground.
That's excellent. So I know I'm mindful that we should be also going into the questions from the audience, but let me just in the next 5 minutes or so just to summarize the hydrogen discussion of what I have learned from a non-specialist audience is that instead of doing by color, go by standards, go by numbers. So instead of colors, from colors, move to numbers. If you have
Yes.
a threshold that in India of three, not more than two, which is kind of an upper bound, so to speak. It's not a hard ceiling, but not more than two, and US has three or more or four.
One.
One in the. But as for the technology now, you can only do about three or
Right.
something like that. That's what you mentioned in the report. So instead of saying which is blue or gray or green or white or yellow, just say these are the numbers, and for our purposes, if we want green hydrogen and also have the transition to cleaner fuel, we would like a standard to be this, and then negotiate the standard. Is
Right.
that more or less what I heard?
Fair enough. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Let me pivot quickly to nuclear, and then I'll come to the financing part. The nuclear is interesting, right? This sector, Aditya, 20 years since the civil nuclear deal. Who would have thought that we are talking today, when all the things that went on to get that deal done in 2005, and we are talking about expanding nuclear in our portfolio and collaboration between the US and India in that. How do you see this evolving? What's your vision? And just assuming that there is this change in the legal framework with or without it. Let's take two scenarios.
Well, I mean, let's look at it like this. I think the intent in the statement that was made under the bilateral when Prime Minister was here in February. I think the intent was pretty clear. It was also followed up with an interesting. I mean, that was also the time when India also had the budget announcement, which kind of made this intent even more clear from a domestic standpoint, right? Which and both happened in the same month. So India announced the nuclear energy mission with the goal of getting 100 gigawatt of installed nuclear capacity over the next 2 decades. I mean, specifically focusing on small modular reactors. And I think, I mean, the US on this side, right? So one thing to realize is that this is a big step up for India because nuclear power has kind of, I think, almost remained stagnant at about 1.2% of India's energy mix for a long time, as opposed to the US where it's closer to the 10% benchmark. But I think, for here in the US, this has always been part of its energy security strategy. There has been the Advanced SMR and R&D program that was there in 2019. DOE has been running a lot of this effort. But with this potential unlocking of the liability issues, I think there is a strategic opportunity here for the two countries to kind of, actually just make this happen, so to speak, because the pieces are there, right? I mean, we've been discussing this cooperation for a long time. We've had these bilateral tracks existing. I would think that this is a no-brainer in as far as the two countries are concerned. I mean, there's also one other update was, I mean, while we were as of I think a month ago, I think DOE also gave regulatory clearance to Holtec, which is a US company, to start transferring SMR technology, right? So I think that's also a significant step in the right direction. So obviously we're already seeing some action happen the moment this has come, and the two countries have worked to kind of resolve some of those outstanding issues. So I think it's a strategic opportunity. It helps to meet the energy security objectives on both sides, but also helps India to really build up its capabilities. And I think there is also some more underlying geopolitical context here from a risk perspective that also become very meaningful as far as the bilateral cooperation goes.
So watch this space, kind of.
Yes. This will be a space to watch for sure. Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
great. Before I hand it over to Medha to see for the audience questions, the last part, and I think it's one of your key recommendations, is financing, right? I mean, all this is great. money is always a problem. Even, I mean, if you talk to the aerospace guys, they will also say that, nah, we still need more. So basic fact of economics, more is better. There's always resource constraint. Now, if I look at the US and India strategy with respect to how you get more investment, India has probably bet on sectors, right? With these missions, through the budget, through public financing. And this has been in India's wheelhouse for many years. That's part of how we do it. On the US side, if I'm not mistaken, it's more on incentives through IRA and other kind of alliances where you try to crowd in through much less of a much more of a risk minimization rather than the government taking on all the risk, right? I mean, in terms of direct investment. Is that a fair assessment? And where do you see those two strategies kind of converging in some way to create a pipeline of financing, both going from the US to India as well as the India to the US?
Yeah, no, I think at the end of the day, I think it all boils down to opportunities, right? And in our context of this blueprint, since we're looking at energy transitions and or the energy sector specifically, there are the opportunities we talked about. But I mean, the same principle would apply across sectors. I think the fundamental focus is that there is intent, capital from here does see India as an opportunity and a good market to play in, but needs a certain level of certainty and de-risking. And to that extent, I think the mission mode approach in India is useful because it starts to set certain sectoral elements and helps to kind of advance the goals in the right direction and unlock on some of the more operational bottlenecks. But I think the more important point sometimes that gets lost in these mission modes is identifying specific
Right.
projects and opportunities for investment.
Exactly.
And I think
Exactly.
India did this some years ago. We created this the National Infrastructure Pipeline. I think this
Yeah.
was 2019, if I
Mhm.
recall right, where this was this intent from India to identify specific infrastructure projects that the private sector can invest in, help kind of drive the economic growth narrative. The same approach can actually be done for the bilateral cooperation as well. I mean, we can identify within each of these priority sectors what are those specific projects for investment, what are the timelines, when do we want them, what is the scale, what is the opportunity, where, even if can go a step ahead and saying which part of India or wherever that opportunity lies, and vice versa, on both ends. But being able to do that and then actually be able to review and monitor this on a periodic basis, I think is where almost having a ready list of pipeline of projects helps the capital to find the right home and move faster. And of course, we will still need some level of policy de-risking, but I think this is where potentially the trade discussions between the two countries, etc., will hopefully create a lot more, streamlined approach for capital to flow and beyond. So, and I think we talked about this earlier. Like, I mean, it's trying to move beyond public sector capital and being able to leverage that multiplier from the private sector. And hopefully, some of these efforts will help. But this is really where I think a lot of this opportunity lies. And I mentioned early on briefly in the context of supply chains the idea of traceability. But I think traceability is a great way to even identify some of those bottlenecks, identify where you need investments in technology, where are your vulnerabilities, do these vulnerabilities exist on both sides? I mean, and you could do this for multiple sectors, right? So the concept of traceability as a tool to identify those opportunities and create those vehicles for investment is where I think is probably an approach that we can take, especially once we have the trade partnership, etc., sorted out. I think these can become really important operational mechanisms to think about. The last thing I'll say on this is we do need on both sides. We do need to then think about what are the new set of financial instruments that the private sector can utilize under this new renewed framework. Then that can help drive capital to come in. I think bottom line, India is a robust market. There is no doubt, and there is an opportunity for us to be able to leverage capital from here. But I will also say that this goes, some of the examples we talked about earlier were also about how India can play in the US market.
Yes.
And it's not just a one-way flow. So to that extent, I think it's also pertinent on our side to think about, on the India side, to think about what does India need
Yes.
from the US to help capital or businesses from India to come and invest in the US. And I think that's a conversation that is less talked about in this context. So maybe there is an intentional, or there should be an intentional conversation on that end as well.
Thank you, Aditya. It has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. First of all, also to take charge of the blueprint. And I hand it over. I look forward to the next blueprint of the next phase of India's energy relationship with the US and energy cooperation. But thank you very much. I hand it over to Medha, my colleague, for some final thoughts and audience questions and
Thank you,
final
Anit.
thoughts.
Thank you, Anit. In the interest of time, I'll just sum up some of our audience questions. Aditya, in the report, you talk about some of the research partnerships, especially getting academia involved in the broader partnership in different stages. And one of our audience members had a question about what the role of academia would be in energy security and emerging energy technologies.
Sure. I think there is a lot that can be done. We talked about the new partnerships on Indus innovation, etc., that have been announced. But I think one thing that India can definitely draw from the playbook here in the US, the US over many years has invested heavily in their academic institutions to build applied research capabilities. I mean, there are national labs, there are centers of excellence, and university research centers and ecosystems, as they call it, for different sectors. Being able to actually leverage the academic ecosystem to be agile and dynamic to the immediate needs or the emerging needs of the economy as a whole is really what the US has done well in being able to create that over many decades. I think this is where it's not just about saying that, oh, there is an opportunity and we want more academic and research institutions on both sides to cooperate, but also for India to then think about how to use that effectively to be able to build and ensure that it contributes meaningfully to meeting some of the larger goals that the country has. I think that is really where I think there is an opportunity for definitely for cooperation, but there's also an opportunity to be able to really uplift and upgrade the system in a way that becomes very strategic for India. And then this builds capability in India for engagement, not just with the US, but just positioning India as a much more competitive ecosystem in the global landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to wrap up, two questions. One, after this blueprint has been published, what do you think are some key questions that need to be thought about, fleshed out further? And say Prime Minister Modi and President Trump are listening in on this conversation. In like two very brief sentences, could you summarize what your recommendations are to them?
Well, I'll put it this way, right? I think there is, as I mentioned, there is very clear shared goals as far as energy security concerned on both countries. There is the opportunity or the intent to ensure affordable, reliable end use energy for everyone, and then there is also a question of how do you strengthen and continue to look at the industrial competitiveness landscape and build that out. So in my mind, while we keep those two objectives as the foundation for this partnership, I think the questions that we need to look at then is where are the avenues for the two countries? One, what are those strategic sectors that we should prioritize within all the engagements and bilateral platforms that we're looking at over the coming months? And while there will be overarching things, can we really pinpoint on those two or three sectors and really help drive them, and then we can move to new things. And then finally, this the needs. I mean, for me, this is not an organic evolution anymore. This has to be an intentional strategy for the two countries to come together and kind of really make this happen. And I think that this is that window of opportunity in at least what I think the way things are framing up may not appear again for a while. So this is really a momentous time for the U.S.-India cooperation to move into a very new realm of strategic bilateral engagement.
Thank you so much, Aditya. Thank you, Anit. Thank you to my colleagues who helped put this report together, helped put this event together. And thank you to everybody who listened in and sent in questions. We look forward to engaging with you all on this topic further for the remainder half of the year. Thank you.